Okay. Anyway, I just want to reiterate something from last week, right? So the whole point of this, the anthropology course, is trying to figure out who we are as a human person in the eyes of God, and what does that mean? And it's really important, for us to keep in mind, what does it mean to be made in His image, right? So we could list things, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I did that last week, right? I said that, we're rational beings, and I said that we have free will, and I said that we are relational, and that we are incarnate beings. So it's not just the body, right? It's actually we're a soul. If we need to say anything, it's not a cover for a book, right? So if we say don't judge a book by its cover, that's not an analogy we can apply to us. We're supernaturally oriented, so we actually, we live our lives here as though there's something that's coming on the next, and we're contingent on God. And all those things you can expand on because they're quite beautiful. It's a beautiful. I always thought and this has been like something since I'm a philosopher that I try to work through these puzzles in my head. If God, says if for love is for Him to will the good of the other, then why are the demons even still around? Because there's no good that can come from them or through them. So that always puzzled me. And then when I was reading one time on how the ancient Israelites understood a tripart aspect of the human person, that we have the body and that we have the soul, but there's also what they'd call the ruah, the spirit. And that spirit is the breath of God that sustains us. Then I thought, well, if God in His essence is love, then it's His love that sustains all things in being, even those that are, incapable of moving, into goodness. And then what's nice about that, and this is where I think, the understanding of the human person from a Catholic standpoint can really be expanded, is, anybody, and our students typically don't have an issue with evolution and creation and how that all went about, but we understand how God's operative in the world. His love literally sustains us. And the only image that works for me is to think what happens to a flower when it no longer has any nourishment. You can almost see that it dries up, it starts to decay and stuff. So it's the breath of God that literally sustains us. So we are literally always on His mind. But yet He's always in the world and He's present in all things, yet we don't have to make the jump like what they would call pantheism, like He's in nature, like He's part of nature. We don't have to make that jump. He's literally there with His breath sustaining all of us. And it also puts us really connected to the created world. So we're not separate from the world that He created. We're all part of this. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And the fact that we're contingent, so that makes us so contingent on Him. And then that also lets us know that, we have to get away from that false notion that heaven is like an achievement, at the end of life. That we have to think more in terms of the kingdom of God, which starts here. So we're actually being made in His image and being deified. So He became man so that we become God. Now, of course, we don't become God, big G like Him, but we actually are made into His image. So it gives us a sense that, all the things that God is, we too share in those. So we sustain each other with our love. Without getting so esoteric, I wonder in the future, what science might reveal. They're already starting to find, like with the human sexuality, with pheromones and such, how we can almost tell we're attracted to people. What do dogs pick up? How can a dog smell or sniff cancer? Did you ever see those stories? So it's not that there's something magical going on there. We just don't understand it. So it'd be curious, in the future to see how, our love between two people can actually sustain us and maybe even add to our own health. And that probably gives us an insight into, how He reaches out to us and how He considers us His own. And then that changes what we'll get into here shortly in a different understanding of sin, that it's not some rule broken, but it's a relationship that's getting clouded and severed. And we'll talk about that more. But okay, then as far as that list, what I thought was really important was to contrast it with what image does the world give of us as people, right? So rather than us being rational beings, right, the world really says we're a slave to our instincts. And we catch ourselves sometimes, right? So if a young kid, gives in to his hormones and his impulses, on some level we're thinking, well, when you're that young and hormones are raging, it's understandable. Now, to say it's understandable is not to condone it, of course. But, the difference between us and all the other animals is that we are not a slave to our instincts. That makes us something that's truly human. And, there really is no other animal in the kingdom. And I think I shared with you that in the summer, I went to a Smithsonian exhibit. Did I mention that? I forget. When you teach and you tell stories, you forget, was that last period, or did I just say that? So I'm not a minister or anything, but I represent my parish at the local ministerium. So a Smithsonian exhibit had chosen Ephrata Library as one of 17 or 19 locations throughout the United States where they would have an exhibit on what is man. Well, okay, that's my territory, so I want to go. Now, of course, it's from a not a biological anthropology point of view. So they had, what do you want to say, top-notch scientists. One had just flown in from Kenya. One, works in New York. Another one was on some other dig. What was interesting is they were saying how this one fossil they found was of probably a 30-something-year-old man or woman, I'm not sure what they said, that had an injury that actually would have been, it would not have allowed them to be mobile. There's no way that they could have taken care of themselves. They can tell that from the injury. But yet this person lived at least 7 years after this. So either people were transporting this person with them as they traveled, or there were other people caring for them. And I mean, this is so early, it astounded them. So they were going on talking about this, and I raised my hand and I said, I'm curious, because I'm not a biologist, are there any other species that have been known or exist now that would do something like that? They says, no, that is absolutely unique to the human. So I think that's interesting. I mean, that says, there's something different about us. Now, we know that we're different than animals, right? But people often say the chimpanzee, I think, shares, 96, depends, it changes a little bit, 96, 97% of our DNA. But, we're not just a product of our DNA, right? There's so much more to us. So whatever that difference is, even if it's little, is big. Because nothing against the chimpanzees, but they have never, written a ballad. They've never composed a major work of art. They've never had a poem. They don't do the things we do. So there's other stuff there that's beautiful. And I think this is a real celebration of the human person. And this is all bears out. Again, I know it sounds cynical, not to your ears, but to many, when we say that the Catholic Church considers itself an expert on the human person. They've had 2,000 years worth of experience, plus, right, if we count our Jewish heritage. And that's important. So, so I think that's something, the fact we're not a slave to our instincts. And also with our free will, we're starting to hear a lot about genetics and epigenetics, and it almost sounds like, well, some of the behaviors we have, they're built in. And some of that might be true. Like, we won't get into it today, but there is no homosexual gene. Even science says that there's nothing, okay? They've already, went through all the research on that. But it could be that there's something epigenetic, right? In other words, maybe in utero or early on, there's things that affect. Think in terms of like smoking, right? Like everybody may not have the same disposition, say, to lung cancer, because we all know people, I do, who smoked 30 years and nothing. And other people that were around it for a short time, secondhand smoke, and then they developed lung cancer. Well, what is that, Perhaps there's something there, but there's an environmental factor that triggers it. And that could be in utero or outside. So, we see things, and I guess what we're doing is sometimes people will make the case, well, this is just simply they were born that way. And it's not just homosexuality. The research behind violence is the same way. Many times they've done research where some people have a propensity for violence or risky behaviors. As a matter of fact, when I do the segment in my classes on homosexual persons, without making a one-to-one analogy, I explain that there's more research, much more research, to support somebody who might be apt to have extramarital affairs because they're akin to risky behavior, and I go on and on. I said, and there is no woman in the world that's going to buy that excuse from their husband after an affair. Sorry, I was born that way. Because we're expected to rise beyond that, right? So we're expected to rise beyond these things that might be built in and might be struggles for us. Who knows? I mean, if a person may not have as much control over their sexual orientation as others, we accept that. But there's no difference. There's nothing else than saying people who are married may have the same struggles with extramarital affairs, even if it remains heterosexual. You don't stop being attracted to the opposite sex because you're married, right? Well, you're expected to somehow manage that. So we move beyond the idea that we're determined. We move beyond the idea that we're a slave to our instincts. And then we really have to focus that it's not just the interior. So when we start talking about how we carry ourselves, how we dress, all these things, we can't push them off like, well, it's not me. We make decisions, judgments on all the things we do, how we act. So it's not just what's inside that's important. It's not just our intentions with each other, but our entire body communicates something. So if you took, I guess there's a course on morality, sexual morality be part of that, you would learn that the whole body communicates something. And communicates intimacy not just in the conjugal sexual intimacy, but in all kinds of things. There's a wonderful, I just saw somebody posted on Facebook, a friend of mine who's like an avid pro-lifer, and she posted this showing how, what we're missing in the world. And I happened to respond to her and say, I've been showing it to my class for 2 years. It's a New York photographer who goes around and finds complete strangers and then poses them in intimate positions. Now, intimate, again, is just close. We're not talking anything indecent here. So what happens is, they're very awkward in the beginning because here you are, I don't know this person, and it might be one was a 90-some-year-old retired fashion designer, and another one was a college poetry professor. And they're supposed to be like holding each other's hands and her putting her head on his shoulder. Well, it's very awkward, but what he found was after 10, 15 minutes, these people felt like barriers were broken down. Like they knew each other. When they interviewed him after, the one young man said, I felt like I cared for her. He said, cared for her? He goes, yes, I really did. And the point is what are we missing? So there's all these aspects, and then this is communicated through the body. So, we know that this is us. We're one incarnate being. I'm not a soul inside, the shell, all right? So it makes me the human person. That's important. And as far as being relational, I don't have the time now, but my one thesis in my philosophy degree was on liturgical anthropology, building and understanding the human person through liturgical relations. So how are we in relation with other people? Well, all the relations that God shares with us, we share with other people, and often it's expressed in rituals at Mass. I don't have time really to go into it or build it, but it's a beautiful understanding of the human person, which means maybe at the heart of it, we're liturgical people. We're built to have these types of relations. And rituals are very important, which again it speaks to us as a body. Like, for instance, not everybody likes the rituals that we have in the Catholic Mass, right? Somebody might say, well, you can go through the motions. And that's true, right? But you could do that with your spouse or your best friend. You can give them a card to say, I love you, and just be saying, I said it, that type of thing. But the idea is all these rituals, we're people that are based on reading signs and communicating through these signs. And they can't be really replaced just with popular music and lively speech. That's not a type of relation that we have. So my one friend, who's actually a Lutheran minister, had a really good point. Has anybody been down to the tomb of the unknown soldier? Have you been down? It's wonderful, isn't it? And did you ever see what happened? Now, wasn't present, but I saw on YouTube what happens if people start getting chatty. I mean, the Marine, I guess it's a Marine, I shouldn't say, I don't know. But the soldier steps off of that mat and then just looking straight ahead in a stern voice yells, "You will be silent!" I mean, it would scare the living crap out of you. And then he goes back to the beginning and starts the whole thing again. Okay, so, how he carries his gun, where it's positioned, how many steps they take. I mean, all of it's very symbolic. And my friend who's a Lutheran minister said, would you really want that ritual replaced with lively music celebrating, our patriotism? And not that there's anything wrong with that, but that would never encapsulate something that's so sacred to us as a people, right? So these rituals are ways that we express our relation. So what happens at Mass isn't something that's distinct or separate from what happens to us in the world. So when we talk about a source and summit, which is important to us, if we're Catholics and the Eucharist is the source and the summit, then it has to have a bearing on who we are as a human person. So anyway, just something to think about there. And let me just, without going over these too much more, about the supernaturally oriented. This is something we all understand, but we have a hard time living it out. In my view, and it's just my view, is that, me included, so I never point my fingers at anybody but myself, we don't live our human lives radically. Most people probably are not attracted to it because we're not giving them a great example of what it means to be a Christian. As a matter of fact, it'd probably be hard to identify most of us from the world. We buy the same cars, we live in the same big houses, we go on the same big vacations, and then all of a sudden we get these saints that grow up among us, from Dorothy Day to you name it. And then we look at these people and we say they're extraordinary. And I think, did Mother Teresa say one time quite humbly, aren't you called to the same holiness I am? We're just hoping, and I'm hoping that she's not the standard, because then we're all done, right? And I don't think that is. But we don't have this radical life because even though we do believe that we're supernaturally oriented, we still like to have as much of it as here as we can. So that's something we all work out in our own spirituality. So anyway, that was, kind of how we ended the last session, and exactly what it meant, how we understand being made in God's image. Now we're going to talk about how that all went away. So today we're going to be talking about sin, the fall, and God's plan for healing. All right? So we are in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So they're told, you can eat from all the trees here except for that one. Isn't it interesting? That's the one they went after. The forbidden fruit has become an analogy for all the things in our lives that are outside of our reach or things that we shouldn't have, but for whatever reason, they look like they taste pretty good. Even if, I guess the grass is green on the other side of the fence, that type of idea. And it's interesting also that I thought, remember after they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, at that time they were told to get out because he did not want them to eat from the tree of everlasting life. I'm not sure if that's what it was. And I thought, isn't that something? Why would you're allowed to eat that one, why didn't you go eat that one? But they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So here we are, today we share in their same sin in many ways, but do we not always try to determine for ourselves what is good and what is evil? We really almost reject this idea of a law that's being imposed on us. So let's think in terms of this as we move on to this. Again, this is the choir, but what I found talking to the young students is that they are hypercritical of the Catholic Church. They will nitpick and go after every little detail and find fault with anything. But the culture, they accept it almost uncritically, almost with their mouths wide open. And I asked them that. I said, now, the thing of it is, I said, if you were in a car accident and you say maybe you caused damage to the person, their neck or something, and they decided to sue you, okay, you would go and get a lawyer, somebody to represent your rights, to make sure that you weren't just simply having some frivolous lawsuit. Now, if somebody came to you and said, why did you get a lawyer? Can't you think for yourself? You would find that almost an odd statement. You would say, well, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have the expertise nor the knowledge that he does. So yes, I'm going to submit myself to him, not as an authority, but I'll submit myself to him because that's understanding. So I don't know what you mean by I should think for myself. I said, but when it comes to the church and who the human person is and how we understand moral judgments, why, now I get it's a little closer to our heart than an accident or something, but why all of a sudden, if somebody submits themselves, just because, let's face it, the church and the ministers of the church and the theologians have a little bit more expertise in this, all of a sudden a person will be accused for not thinking for themselves. I think of my mother, who, is quite I'll say, submissive. So she has no problem saying, well, I want to make sure I'm doing what the church wants of me. And to other family members of mine, that sounds like, well, come on. What, are you in a cult? You can't think for yourself? But you're putting yourself in the trust of somebody who you really, really, well, let's put it this way, that you really do trust. So there's not a lot of difference between that and calling a plumber who's better than you, or calling a doctor, or anything else. So when we talk then about the fall and what that means, and then where we're at now, the church has something to say on that, and I think it's worth hearing. And oftentimes that's not accepted by the people on the outside, but so be it, all right? Okay, so here you have Adam and Eve, and they eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that's the game changer, okay? And here's the thing. Satan is the greatest of liars, right? Isn't he? He's the king of all liars. If Satan were, and we have to think in our own lives, if he were to appear to us in some medieval stereotype with, horns and a pitchfork and a red tail, we would all be able to identify him, and we would steer clear. And he mixes truth with lies. As a matter of fact, he's so good at what he does, his subtlety is almost sometimes undiscernible, which is why we have to have such a deep spiritual life, all right? He's at battle for us. There's a story from the 4th century by a guy named Prudentius. He's a Latin poet. And the poem is called Psychomachia. It just means battle of the soul, right? And what's neat about it is that all the virtues and the vices are personified, so you can almost see the battle going on in your mind. It's not that long of a poem, but it's written in a little bit different style. So what happens at one point is greed shows up, the vice of greed, right? And greed is this old haggard woman. And the virtues and the vices have battled, and there's some dead, slain virtues on the battlefield. And the ministers of Christ, the priests, come out to minister to these virtues. Well, greed's going around pillaging, right? Taking all the gold and everything, the spoils of battle. And she's trying to entice the priest with all this gold and all this, but they see her for who she is. They figure this person, this is greed, and, we can stay away from greed by our, just through the strength of the grace within us. So greed discovers this. So greed then transforms herself into a young, beautiful woman. And she changes her name from greed to thrift. And then sells herself as, shouldn't you be thrifty? And then all of a sudden, that seems reasonable. And she's in. Did anybody ever see the movie The Devil's Advocate? With Keanu Reeves and... this is terrible because I know he was in The Godfather. He was Michael Corleone. This is terrible. I'm having a total blank out. Okay. Anyway, here, let me give you the story. He's this Keanu Reeves is a young lawyer, and he's representing a mentally challenged girl who had been raped. I'm sorry. He's representing a man who had raped a mentally challenged young girl. He manages to get him off. He has a perfect winning streak. So then he gets brought through various channels to New York to be a high-powered attorney. And what he realizes, Al Pacino, and what he realizes that Al Pacino is the devil, and he realizes that he's now being part of the devil's plan. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but he thwarts the plan. And what he does is he finds himself back in that courtroom, back at the beginning, almost like none of it ever happened. So this time he's going to do the right thing, and he recuses himself as the lawyer. Well, this just starts, all this him-hawing within the courtroom. And on his way out, even his wife is saying, "What'd you do, baby? What's going on?" He says, but he knows, he kept all the knowledge of what life would have been like had he got this person off. So the reporter tries to get him, to give him the scoop on the way out. And Keanu Reeves says, no, look, I'm done. And this reporter keeps on him and says, come on, a lawyer with a conscience? This is a story. Come on, just give me some lead. all right, call me in the morning. And then all of a sudden the lawyer turns and he morphs into Al Pacino and he says, pride, got him. In other words, that's Satan. I mean, it's never coming at us from the front. So, we have to be totally on guard. So that's why I say we don't live radical enough. We don't know how these things, are really holding us down. All the things. I'm not talking about material things. All the things that have their fingers in us, right? So anyway, just something, I was thinking about. Okay, original sin. So as a matter of the fall, right, we have original sin. Now, this is not personal sin, right? It's not a personal fault. It's typically, has thrown us into a state of concupiscence, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But original sin is usually identified as a loss of original justice and a loss of original holiness. And we all can repeat that, and we're like, what does that mean? I lost two things. Think of what being justified before God is. It's like you're in right relationship with all things. Me and you are in right relationship, we're in right relationship with nature. All these things have been damaged by the fall. So I'm no longer in a right relationship with any of those things. So what does that mean? It means I can easily abuse you or the environment. And half the time I don't even know I'm doing it. It has to be brought to my attention. Like little things. Like when I do journals with the kids in the morning, I explain to them, when you brush your teeth, what do you do with the water? I turn it on. So while you're brushing your teeth, the water's running down. It's not a Christian thing to do. So it's a sin. Okay, can we stop trying to identify everything as whether that's a sin or not? Let's talk in relational terms. The water that you have left go down that drain, some people don't have, to drink all day. And I know you shutting that faucet off doesn't send water, to wherever it needs to be. But it does change the way you think about it, doesn't it? So I always tell them, my mother, she takes her glass, she won't even throw water in the sink. She just grew up in the Depression. So she puts rubber bands and ceramic around all her water glasses, and she leaves them there until she finishes them. Okay, now that doesn't change the world's water supply, but it does change her, which is really what this is all about, right? I mean, we're all in this, we're in a community, the people of God, but we are trying to transform ourselves, which brings us to the next thing, this loss of holiness, right? So we lose original justice and original holiness. Well, God himself is holy, so now we're not in right relationship with God. Well, how does that manifest itself? It gives us a distorted vision of him. And oftentimes we don't have a good vision of God. Who knows what your or my vision is? It changes, right? Sometimes he's the great lawmaker. Or how about this one, that he's the accountant. And no matter what's going on in your life, he's making column notes. And you better hope you got more in this column than that column. I mean, we know that's not right, but I think that sometimes, right? Is it a scale? Do I got more good and the bad, this type of thing? Or do we only come to him when we need something? So is he like the genie, right? When somebody's sick or things aren't going good, I need money, And then what kind of promises do we make, right? Bargains, and then as the joke goes, if everybody gets better or you get your car that you want, and then you're trying to find your way out of the parking, Like I really, didn't mean it that much, He'll understand, he's God, that type of thing. So, we're in this state where everything's disordered, all right? So, and that includes us. So we can understand like original sin as like a disorder between our desires and our reason. I mean, we can't direct our reason the right way. We see through the glass dimly. So it's hard for us to really understand. Like sometimes we don't know what the right thing is to do. We do our best, but it's hard. We try to raise our children right. We try to act ourselves right. And then we're weak. And that's on top of it. We cave in. It doesn't take too much sometimes for any one of us to fall into some disordered relationship. I'm not talking extramarital, just a relationship that's not, really cohesive to our own spirituality. Because this is very difficult. And he knows that. And he knows that we're in a fallen state. How do we know that he knows it and sympathizes with us? Well, first of all, didn't he make aprons for Adam and Eve? He knew, he knew that he had to protect them from the lustful stare, what we'd call the interior gaze was gone. The time when Adam could look at Eve in her original nakedness and see Eve. And Eve can look at Adam in his original nakedness and see Adam. All of a sudden, now we can use each other for our own pleasure, right? So we have these different, and I think we'll talk about different states of concupiscence, right? So God knew that, and he says, I have to fashion aprons to protect each other from the gaze of that. And then we have the first good news. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and hers. You will bite her ankles, and she will crush your head. So now we know there's a plan, and he's going to restore this. That's happened. So the entire Old Testament, which we might walk through, I think if not now, right after the break, walk through some of the covenants, which are just a crescendo of various relationships that are getting built between us and God until his son can come and reveal. And let's face it, that's the ultimate revelation. When Christ came, now we knew what it meant to be man. We can really get it from him. So anyway, that's kind of what we're talking about here. So now we're in a dominion of death. And there's what I think is in the outline as the threefold concupiscence. There's the sensual lust. We have an inordinate desire for physical gratification. It's odd. I saw it. Anybody watch Seinfeld? Anybody? Yeah, okay. I don't know if you remember the episode where he was talking about, he thought pornography was just an odd thing. And he said, I don't quite get it. He said, you look at a picture and that's the extent of this. He said, to me, it's the equivalent of going to a really fine restaurant and watching a nice young couple eat a juicy steak through the front glass. He says, all you're looking at is going, that looks good. And that's the extent of it. You can never taste it. You can never have the experience they're doing, any of that stuff. It was his joke, but it was a pretty good analogy. But we struggle with that all the time, because this is part of our state. This is part of us in our body, is that we struggle with those temptations. And they're all regulated by the virtue of temperance, which, by the way, is one of the lower ones, right? So, if you work through the theological virtues of love, hope, and faith, and then you have the cardinal virtues, right? You have prudence, justice. Isn't this terrible how my mind goes? There's another one, and I'll think of it, but anyway, the lower one's temperance. Temperance regulates those things that we need, food and sex. So it's we have that disorder we deal with too. I love desserts. Sorry. I love bread, sauce, and cheese. Those are the three basic food groups. So we all struggle with this. So these are all what they were calling sensual lust, this inordinate desire for physical gratification, no matter how we might receive that, okay? Then they talk about lust of the eyes, greed and covetousness. We want things for ourselves. Pride of life, arrogance, ostentation, and lifestyle that reflects a willful independence from God and others. And I think, without getting into any of the economic theory behind the Catholic social teaching, is what is always being warned about rich. Now, we'd have to qualify who's rich and who's poor. But the idea is that typically the more money we have, the more satisfied and content we feel with our lives. And we seem to have that as a sense of achievement that's going to protect us from future happenings, right? I have enough in my 401k. I have, a big enough house. It's paid for. And we go down the line, and then we read something in Scripture about the guy who put up the 7 bins and said, now I have enough stored. I can eat, drink, and be merry. And then that very night he lost his life, So that we always are going to have this struggle between the things that are necessary for our common good as a people, our safety, and things that are necessary for us that we are in the body. And then, are these things are we using them for their own purpose, or are we using them for our purpose? It's just a spirituality that we struggle with. So we're thankful to have people like the Franciscans and such who always can stand there as a witness and say, look, in the end, this is really, it's going to be more of a hindrance to your faith than anything. And what's interesting, if you ever read the stories of St. Francis, he didn't want to help the poor. That was never his real concept. He wanted to be like them. He thought for some reason that life was just, the austere life was better. So anyway, it's always the battle of these things, right? And even some saints really take it what I think is just too far, right? You want to wear a hair shirt, knock yourself out. You start hitting your stuff with things on the back, I don't know. I think now you're just going a little off the wide side. There's nothing wrong with, fasting is a type of corporal, resistance to temptation, right? Because we're trying to train our bodies. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think if we take things too far, we're starting to lose fact of what this is supposed to be advantageous for our spirituality. And I don't know, it's just my opinion that hitting yourself on the back with certain whips is not going to do it. But in some medieval times, they did, right? So when I said we have the struggle between our desires and our reason, the desires, I think they refer to in your outline as appetites. The appetites, they say, are not simply bad, but they have to be informed about by virtue. And then, this is in your outline, right? I think so. I'm sure it is, because if it's in bold on mine, that means I did not write it. Plus, it doesn't look like something I would have wrote. But it says there is irascible and concupiscible appetites. I'm just going to basically tell you about these. No, you come right in. I didn't have any way to contact you. Because of the snow, we just started a little early, so that way we don't have to add another class. But before you leave today, the diocese wanted your information so they can get in touch with you.
No, they don't have it. They don't answer their phone. They don't return phone calls, and I don't read minds.
There you.
And I'm sorry that I missed this. I mean, I would have come.
No. That's okay. I had no way to contact you. I should have got your information before we left the first time. But the diocese asked us to make up the class, and rather than add another day, I thought we'd just come a little early and hang out an extra 15 minutes. Do that twice, that makes up some of the time. I thought, and everybody kind of thought that was a good idea.
How much did I miss?
You missed 30, 35 minutes.
That's a lot.
I'm recording it.
Oh, you're recording?
Yeah,
Oh,
you can buy the best of CD or whatever it is.
Pardon?
You can buy the best of CD when it comes out. No, I'll make this available to you. That's not a problem.
Okay.
That's not a problem.
Thank you. So
Oh.
what time do we come next week?
Well, we'll decide that before we leave today,
Oh,
exactly
okay.
what everybody's
Thank
on
you.
top of. You bet. So anyway, it has in the outline the concupiscible and the irascible, okay? So big words for two categories that simply mean one of them is controlling things that are useful and pleasurable, and the other one is helping us overcome obstacles, right? So and this comes from Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas lists under the concupiscible love and hatred, these two things. He lists desire and aversion, joy and sadness. So there's always this disorder between us with these various appetites. With the irascible, again, these are things that are helping us overcome obstacles. So he lists hope and despair, courage, fear, and anger. All right? So here's the thing I guess we could say about this. This might seem like a high price to pay, all these disorders in our life, the loss of original justice and holiness. But I think I used the analogy in the last class is any sin against an infinite being has an infinite price to pay. Remember, I used the analogy that if two students were throwing a fist at each other, they'd probably get a day in school suspension, or who knows. If they threw a fist at me, it could be, suspension. And if they go, and I'm no better than a student, but if they went out and threw a fist at a policeman, okay, now they're going to have to contend with the law. Well, the policeman's no better than me, but he is greater of authority. And we went down the line. If you went down to the White House and tried to take a swing or jump into Barack Obama, well, welcome to Leavenworth, okay? And Barack Obama is no greater than a policeman, nor me, or than a student, okay? But the greater the authority. Well, once we get to God, we're talking about an infinite being, then any detraction against him is payable for this. Plus, we have to realize that, this isn't, it's not a personal sin we inherit from them. It's the state that we inherit. But in all likelihood, I'd make the same mistake if I were Adam. I'm sure we would have. This is one of the problems of having free will, is that when he allows us to choose him, which is the only thing love can do, you're always at risk. And the risk is what he did. But the beauty of it is that he's going to restore it, which we'll get to in a little bit. So anyway, grace. I just want to say something about grace before we might want to take 2 breaks today. I don't know if I shared this with you, but this was my struggle growing up. I could not figure out how to understand grace. All I kept thinking was to quantify it. And all well-intentioned, too often some priests would even really, I think, screw up my understanding of it. They'd say, you receive grace in the sacraments. Well, of course, we understand that. And he says, and you receive sanctifying grace and you're baptized. and then there's actual grace. And by the way, we divide different types of grace. That was never the case before the Reformation. The Reformation really changed things in terms of how the church had to articulate stuff. So all of a sudden now they had to articulate different types of grace, and sacramental grace, actual grace, sanctifying grace. But nonetheless, it's best understood as life in Christ. And the only way for me to understand what it made sense with Mass, in other words, so I receive the Eucharist, I receive grace. And, and the priest would say yes. And then, during the week, it's like it kind of wears down because life's tough, you're busy, you're tired, and you need to come back, and then you're reuniting with Christ in the Eucharist, and you get infused with grace again, and then you're good. And that just, quite frankly, may be true, maybe it worked for somebody, but it was utterly insufficient for me. Because all I can get in my head, and maybe because I'm too analytical, is I would think, what is Mass? Is it a gas station? I mean, do I go there with my jar, and then I get so much, and then it's used like my gasoline tank would go down during the week, and then I go back? It just didn't make any sense to me, right? So the way I worked it out was in total relation. In other words, if you look back, what did it mean in the early days, let's say even 200 years ago, when somebody said, how did they use the word grace? Does anybody remember? Well, not remember like you were there, but remember from the stories or such. Like, are you in my good grace? So you're in somebody's favor. So in other words, really, you're saying, what is it between me and you? What is our relationship like? Now, anybody that has an intimate relationship, whether it's friendships, mother-daughter, husband-wife, you know when you're good with each other. And you know what damages that. So, in a sense, that's how we understand our relationship with Christ. We have to stop looking at this in terms of, He gives me grace, and then grace helps me go to heaven. That is very true. But it doesn't really help my spirituality, and I'm just going to guess maybe it doesn't necessarily help you. I'd rather hear somebody explain it to me that He's giving me a relationship, and as I grow in the kingdom of God, I'm coming closer to Him. In other words, I'm being more like Him. I'm imaging Him in greater ways. And then the love, you can't quantify or really articulate the love you have for your child, your spouse, friend, sister. It's really hard, right? How do you do that? But yet you know when things are good. So we know when we're in each other's grace, our good favor. So really, when you use the definition life in Christ, that's a perfect definition as long as we know that we're being drawn into Him. And that this is really not something we achieve in the end, getting to heaven, but that it comes into completion. We always have visions of what heaven will be like. And I'm hoping we're all wrong, because our visions are pretty good. And if He says neither ear has heard nor eye has seen, then I'm going to take Him for His word and say, my best vision is not going to even get close to what that is. But it's easier for the students, right? Because do you remember what it was like when you first saw somebody and you fell in love? You couldn't explain that, but it was energizing to you as an individual. And it drew you two together in ways that maybe only science 100 years from now will explain how that happens. Well, if we're made in His image, we're made for Him. And we're made like Him. So there are attributes of us that, although obviously not divine, and we'll never see the beatific vision here, that would be heresy, right? But yet we're being drawn to Him. And I really think that's what the liturgy is. And that's what liturgy pulls us in. So it's not so my connection, to go back to the human person in liturgy and relationality, was that all those things and it ties in here on a second, all those things in our life, all the mishaps, all the sacrifices that we make, all those things that then are brought. So then when we go to liturgy, we can honestly say, accept this sacrifice at your hand, our sacrifice at your hands. Because if you really think about it, why is it our sacrifice? Isn't that what some of the lower Protestant church claims are against us? That we have to do them over and over again, and that Jesus did it all? And our response is, yes, He did it all. But what does the beauty of our faith say is that He's allowing us to unite ours to His. As pitiful as our sacrifices are compared to His, Because it's not just the fact that he was crucified. This was something else I struggled with. You know, nobody would die like that except for other people. But didn't they crucify a lot of people? Yeah. So, I mean, why was his so terribly worse? I mean, let's just say it was worse, but was it the worst way to die of anything we could imagine? So was it just the fact he did that for us? Or was it, as we're understanding here, the restoration of our imaging? And all the things that we are doing to destroy that. It'd almost be like if we had the power in a relationship, which we don't, right? To take all those faults and all those sacrifices and bring them to ourselves. Say, I'll carry them for you. I mean, we will love, and we even use those terms, right? Like, I need somebody in my support system. I need to unburden on you. But we know that you're really not unburdening. We feel better when we get it off our chest, but it's still there, right? What if the person really had the ability to say, I'll receive it all? I mean, I'm just really thinking aloud here. I'm not trying to be profound. But this is a class about the human person, what it means. I think that's something unique to us. And not in any deference to the separated brethren who are Protestant, but they can't share that. They don't have that same sacramental relation, you know, which they might tend to see as overly ritualistic, but the ritual is just encapsulating the love and the relation between two people. So that's how I understand grace. Now, you see, that's more like painting a picture than giving a definition, right? But isn't that usually what's necessary when you're into profound topics like that? What does it mean to be in his grace? You know, it means to be in love with the lover. And it means not to just be giddy over it, but just as, you know, and we can't separate our world from his. So I don't, you know, it's not like an either or thing, like the affection and the love that I give my wife, I really should direct towards God. That would be a perverse way of understanding it. It's like, it's because of the image in these other people. So, you know, and you think of how this can be applied in all our various social justice things. You name it, from abortion to, you know, capital punishment, you name it. You know, it would be tough to not see how there is no way you can lose that dignity. There's nothing that we can do. That's an understanding of a human person that's unique to us too. You could be punished, your liberties can be taken away, you could be restrained, whatever, but you never lose that dignity because it wasn't something that you earned in the beginning. It was simply that you were made in their image. Why? Because when mom and dad came together in a marital embrace and we were the result of it, they were not the origins of our soul. So those other qualities of us came from God, and they're meant to be returned towards him. So just an interesting insight. So if any of that doesn't make sense, I'm sorry. I didn't really think through it before. Let's see if there's anything else here that I should hit. No, because we'll take a little break, because what I want to start on when we come back is we'll look through the various covenants. So how's that sound? Let's take like a 10-minute break.